Galatians chapter 6 will be the text for our lesson this evening, and for the most part, we're going to stay right in this text. And we're going to attempt to explain exactly what Paul is talking about in this text. And also, as well, as with every text, it's not an academic exercise. It is an exercise of determining the meaning, and then once the meaning has been determined, okay, my dad used to say, okay, what's the so what of that? We've got the meaning of the text. What do I do with that? And so we'll have some applications that I think are pertinent from this particular text. You can see on the slide that the lesson for this evening is the attitude toward the overtaken. Galatians 6 and verse 1. Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not in regard to another. For each one will bear his own load. We're going to spend some time defining some words as we come to each one of these sections to make sure that we recognize what it is exactly that's being discussed here. The very first thing that we find in this text is that we are dealing with someone, a person, who has been, the text says, caught. Caught in a trespass, but we want to pause for just a moment and think a little bit about this word, caught. You see on the screen, Zodiades suggests that this word, you can look at other lexicons, it has the idea of overtaken. And so that's the idea of being overtaken in something. But because of a preposition right before that Greek word, it's a little bit unsure, not that it's really of any account whatsoever, but is this something that one just accidentally or without realizing was caught, or recognizing what he was doing and he just got caught in that? I mean, the idea of caught can be one of two ways. And Zodiades suggests this. He said if the preposition is taken in an instrumental way in the Greek, then the idea is that the fault, which is the word that we're going to define in just a minute, the trespass, peripatoma, catches the individual by surprise. Suddenly, without notice. That is, before he's aware of what has happened. And I think we could look at that and say, well, I can relate to that. Because there have been times in which maybe we've said something, or maybe we've started something and we've thought, what was I doing? We got caught up in the moment, caught up in whatever it might be, and we found ourselves suddenly caught by surprise, even caught ourselves by surprise, and something that was said, or an attitude that came out, or an action that was taken. Zodiades also suggests that it could also be in what's called the concessive phrase, this preposition. And that comes from this idea of even if. And it seems to introduce, he says, an exceptional case implying a scandalous or flagrant sin. The preposition could therefore be taken as a locative and have reference to someone being caught in the act of a particular sin. In other words, there is a sense in which I catch myself and I'm surprised by that, and there is a sense in which I am caught. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that because really it doesn't matter. This idea of whether I catch myself by surprise or whether I am caught. The problem is, here's an individual that whether he catches himself or whether he is caught in a trespass, what is it? What is the attitude toward that one? It was kind of interesting to me that when you read in this particular text and you begin to run some words, sometimes we think trespass and sin and transgression, and that is always going to be that hamartia, the word, which generally, when we think about the idea of sin, we have this idea of the missing of the mark. Here is the standard, here is the target, and you missed it. That's the idea of sin. Here's the standard of righteousness, and you missed that. But there are other words that's found in the Greek that also carry with it the idea of sin or trespass or transgression. And that's the word used in this text. The idea of periptoma. Thayer says that is the idea of a fall beside or near something. Tropically, a lapse or deviation from truth, and a brightness, a sin or misdeed. Now, think about that. If you're thinking about the idea of hamartia is the idea of missing the target, you're not far from the same idea here when you look at it fell beside or near something. You know, they used to say, the saying used to be, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. And that's this kind of, it was near, it fell beside, it missed the mark. I was going for that, but it fell beside it. It fell near it, but it missed it. So we're really splitting hairs here, aren't we? When it comes to the idea of, is there a real significant difference between these two words? And no. There is a standard that was missed. There is a deviation from that which should have been done. There is a sin or a misdeed. Zodiades basically says the same thing. It's to fall by the wayside. It's a fault or a lapse or an error or mistake. It's a wrongdoing. Although it represents the errors or faults of weakness, it does not necessarily fail to imply culpability. It may be a fault of weakness, but that doesn't mean just because I was weak doesn't mean that I'm not culpable. Doesn't mean I'm not guilty. Doesn't mean I'm not responsible for that. Another lexicon definition from the lexicon of Moulton and Milligan said it's a slip or a lapse rather than a willful sin in the connotation suggested. Now I want you to think about this idea of however you want to define this. Say, well, we think that, it's that sin, that hamartia, that idea, that's the one, that's the critical one. But I want you to think about, just because we may be looking at a sin that may be by weakness, that is a falling beside, that just missed the mark a little bit, that doesn't mean there's any less or dire consequences. It's interesting that it's this same word in Ephesians chapter 2 that caused our spiritual death. Now there's a reason why I think we need to make sure that we recognize this, because of a point we're going to make in just a minute. But I want you to think about it in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1, when Paul says, and you were dead in your trespasses. That's this word, periptoma. You were dead in your trespasses and sins. There's the other word. So there's not a lot of difference, is there? You look at verse 5, you have this same idea. Even when we were dead in our transgressions, that's the same word, periptoma. This word is no less severe, and the consequences are no less severe than the idea of missing of the mark. These are synonymous terms. Caused our spiritual death. It is in Romans chapter 4 and verse 25 that this same word is used again. And it tells us there that this caused Jesus to have to be delivered to death. He was delivered over because of our transgressions. We may read that and think, that's that word, hamartia, the missing of the mark. But no, it's actually this word, periptoma. Because of our misdeeds, Jesus had to be delivered. And then finally, it required Jesus' blood for our redemption. As a result of our misdeeds. Ephesians 1 and verse 7. In Him we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of His grace. The only reason that I spend a little bit of time going through that is just to make sure that we understand that when we come to the Greek, there's going to be more than one word used in reference to transgression and trespass and sin. It's going to be more than one word used in that. And the Bible uses these things interchangeably, because you'll see the same word talked about in reference to our sin that caused Jesus to have to be sent to the cross, in the word hamartia as well as periptoma. But what's interesting about this text is that the rest of this text is addressed to those who were not caught or who are not overtaken in this trespass or in this sin or in this transgression. And that stands to reason, doesn't it? Because if you're writing a letter, do you really think the one in transgression is going to be reading the letter? No, but those who are receiving the letter are going to be aware of those who are in transgression and who are in sin and who have trespassed. And so they need to figure out, okay, well, we know of people who are in that position. What do we do? What is our attitude? How should we feel toward them? And I want to suggest to you that this text does two things. The first thing that it does is it answers the question of what should my attitude be toward this one? Toward this one who was caught. Toward this one who exerted a lapse of judgment. Toward this one who was overtaken in a transgression or a sin. But it also addresses another question. And that is, what might I think his sin says about me? That might seem a strange question to address. And I say, well, okay, we've got someone in transgression, we've got someone in sin. Okay, well, I can see the application of, well, what should my attitude be toward the one who is in sin? How do I respond to that? What do I do? What's my attitude? I get that. But then you have this other question that obviously Paul recognizes could be an issue, could be a problem. Someone actually might have and think that in looking at this individual's sin, that individual's sin might say something about me. Paul says we need to address that and make sure that you don't have that idea. So, what should my attitude be toward this one who has sinned? Well, let me give it to you right up front, and then we'll look at all three of these. What should my attitude be toward this one? Number one, I should want him restored. First and foremost, that's my goal of wanting him restored. And secondly, I need to treat him with gentleness. And thirdly, I should help him bear his burdens. Now, as you look at that list, does it seem to get a little more uncomfortable the further we go down that list? Oh yes, I want him restored, but I've got to be gentle in that. Do you recognize what he did? Do you recognize what she did? Do you recognize the ramifications and the consequences and the hurt that was involved in that? Do you recognize what is going to take place as a result of that? Do you recognize what I had to endure? Do you recognize the damage control that I had to do? Do you recognize that? Do you recognize that he wasn't thinking about that? He was selfish. Do you recognize that she was selfish? That she wasn't thinking about that? And yet he still says gentleness. And then it says, bear his burden. Let's think about all three of these things and see if some of these are kind of a challenge for us. I should want him restored. Now remember, we've already said and we've already noticed that the word that's involved here in trespass is just a synonym to the typical word that we see in reference to sin. It's the same word that required Jesus to be sacrificed upon the cross. It's the same word that brought us spiritual death. And so now here is this one who has returned to that. And so I should want him restored. That word means to refit or repair. We all understand, I think, especially if we put it in a context of what it means to restore something. Somebody's got an old car in their garage and they say, you know what I want to do with that? No, what are you going to do? I'm going to restore that. No one says, what do you mean by restore? We all know what that means. I'm going to get that back to its original condition, where it was originally. And so that's what this idea is. I'm going to refit that. I'm going to repair. I'm going to mend that which was broken. I'm going to restore them back to where they were. Now, I want you to consider something. Since this is a Christian that's under consideration here, And since this is the same word for the trespass which brought spiritual death, and since this is a situation wherein restoration is needed, therefore one can trespass in such a way as to lose his salvation. Now, this isn't a text that we typically go to, I don't think, a lot when we talk about the doctrine of impossibility of apostasy. And yet, by virtue of that word that's used in this text, and by virtue of seeing that that word for sin and trespass is the same word that brought spiritual death, the same word that required Jesus' death, by virtue of that this man has now gone back to that, and that he needs to be restored from that, and that we're not talking about someone who wasn't in a new state. He wasn't in the original state, if you will, of being a child of God. He has left that new state. He has been overtaken. He's back over here now, and we want to bring him back to where he was. So that implies the fact that he was actually saved. You don't restore that which is already in its original condition and has never lost that. But something that was in an original condition, lost that by virtue of whatever, now needs to be brought back and restored. Someone who was saved, who has now been overtaken in a trespass, and they now need to be repaired. They now need to be brought back. Since this is a Christian, since this is the same word, since this is a situation of restoration, brethren, you can lose your salvation. This verse states that. But think about the need for this exhortation. Doesn't that seem strange? Think about that. Here is a child of God who had been walking with these brethren. And now he's left these brethren. He's trespassed. He's fallen. He's been overtaken in a trespass or a sin. Wouldn't it be the automatic reaction that those he had walked with, that he has now left, that those who have been left, wouldn't they automatically want him to be restored? And the fact that Paul has to say, you who are spiritual, restore such a one, suggests there may be some who seem for some reason or another, he deserves what he's going to get. What a terrible, horrible, ungodly, unloving attitude. It just struck me that Paul says you need to restore this one. I thought that would be a given. So I've got some questions down here. I wonder, do we desire they learn a lesson? Oh, I'm fine with restoring them, but I want them to suffer a little bit. Do we desire they suffer some consequences? Is our attitude, well, they should have known better. And they do know better. They know how to come back. They know how to return. They once were with us. They know what they've done. They know how to confess. They know how to repent. They ought to come back. I don't really have a responsibility in this. And yet what does Paul say? You have a responsibility to go and refit, restore, repair. Sometimes we have the idea, well, they left, they know where the door is, they can come back. What a sorry attitude. Paul says, no, you need to restore this one. What should be my attitude toward this one? Paul said it should be the attitude of gentleness. For me, I think this is one of the more interesting words in the Bible because it is also one of the more difficult words to define. Because generally, the word in the later versions, gentleness is generally the word that's used. But in some of the older versions, it was the idea of meekness. And that's kind of a difficult word to define. It's not that the idea is difficult, it's just that we don't seem to have a really good word that fits that idea. Let me give you some definitions. Loanita in their lexicon says, gentleness of attitude and behavior in contrast with harshness in one's dealings with others. Gentleness, meekness, mildness. In fact, it says in a number of languages, gentleness is often expressed as a negation of harshness. So that gentleness may often be rendered as not being harsh with people. You know, sometimes we say, well, it's hard for me to define, but I'll give you the opposite. And that will help you see what I'm talking about. It's not this. Oh, okay. So gentleness is a negation of harshness. It's not being harsh with people. Now, where is this brother? He's in sin. His sin may have some consequences, may have some connection to the congregation and the people in the congregation, and his sin may have hurt some of them. Their attitude still is, go to him, not with harshness. But gentleness may also be expressed in some instances in an idiomatic manner. Now, an idiomatic just simply means several words grouped together as a phrase. You can't just pick out the words and define them, but you've got to put them all together. And so we have a lot of idioms in our language that you can't just pick out the words, but you've got to take the whole phrase. And so here's this idea. Always speaking softly to. There's the idea of gentleness. Or not raising one's voice. That's the idea in Loanita's lexicon. Vine says the common assumption is that when a man is meek, it is because he cannot help himself. In other words, he has no choice but to be meek. Which, as Vine says, the Lord was meek because he had the infinite resources of God at his command. Described negatively, meekness is the opposite of self-assertiveness and self-interest. It is equanimity. That may be the closest word that we have in the English language for meekness. It is equanimity of spirit that is neither elated nor cast down simply because it is not occupied with self at all. One of the things that I think we need to recognize in reference to meekness, and it's what Vine points out, that the man that's meek isn't meek because he has no other option available to him. That's Vine's point. No, he's got another option. In Numbers chapter 10, we are told that Aaron and Miriam opposed Moses. And the character of Moses was that he was meek. So when would be the best time for the Lord to explain to us, here is Moses being meek? When Moses was challenged, and his leadership was challenged, not by the elders who had already challenged it, not by the rest of the children of Israel who had already murmured against him, his own family. Now, what could Moses have done? A lot. What did Moses do? Did Moses have choices available to him as to how he might deal with his brother and his sister? Yes. But it is at that moment that we're told that Moses was the meekest man on earth. Its strength under control. And Vine acknowledges the fact that when someone recognizes that they have an ability, they have an option, they could pursue this course, but in view of the person involved, it's better for them if they pursue this course. That's the meek man. Moses could have reamed out Aaron. Moses could have reamed out Miriam, but that would have been no benefit to them. They were sinning, and they needed to be restored. And so Moses, in his meekness, did not embarrass them in the face of the Israelites. God took care of that. God dealt with the situation. Moses was meek. He wasn't looking just at himself. So I want you to think about some observations from this. I may be well within my rights. If I'm the spiritual going to restore this one, I may be well within my rights to really giving them a chewing out. They may deserve it, in my mind. What a stupid thing for you to do. You know better than that. What were you thinking? And boy, you can just wax eloquent with your rebuke. But does that really help the one who needs restoring? or help me by being given an opportunity to vent my frustrations with them. Remember what Vine said? That if someone needs restoring, that the man who has gentleness, and that's my attitude toward the one who needs to be restored, it's not about me. I might say to myself, I'm going to go give that guy, I'm going to go give that woman a piece of my mind. Now, is that going to help them be restored? Make me feel a whole lot better, wouldn't it? Well, I feel good if I go give them a chewing out. But wait a minute. The spirit of gentleness says it's not about you. It's not about you venting your frustrations on them and venting your frustrations about what they did or how they acted or the ramifications of whatever their sin or trespass might be. It's not about me. Kind of challenging, isn't it? When, boy, I'd really like to give them a piece of my mind. The second thing I want you to think about, if I go to restore such a one, and someone is caught in trespass and they're in sin, and the spiritual go to restore someone, you know, I may be personally attacked. If you've ever gone to restore someone and you had to do that very often, you have been personally attacked. I've been personally attacked just because I was there to try to show an individual the sin in their life and they attacked me. I may be personally attacked by the one who needs restoring, but will my responding in kind really help the one who needs restoring or help me defend my reputation? I will acknowledge to you and confess to you that as a young preacher, there was a situation that I was in attempting to restore someone. They attacked me, I attacked back. Now, fortunately, she was restored. But I did some damage that day that caused that restoration to take longer than it should have taken. And for her now to not just overcome her sin, but my response to her attack. I'm thankful to the Lord that she did return. But I tell you, I learned a lesson that day. And as I studied this passage, I really learned that, okay, I can't return in kind. Why is that? Because it's not about me. And I guarantee you, 9 times out of 10, well, maybe I shouldn't be quite so cynical. 8.5 times out of 10, I can guarantee you a goodly number of times when you go to someone who is in sin, most of the time, with the kindest, gentlest, most prayerful attitude that you have, many times they will return that with personal attacks. They will get defensive. They will get irate and angry. What does God say? Your attitude is one of gentleness. In the face of that, be gentle. But they're attacking me. They're maligning me. Wait a minute. What are you there for? You're there to restore them. It's not about you. That's the attitude of gentleness. Think about the third attitude that he gives. And that is, I should help bear his burdens. We're still in this text. You who are spiritual, restore such one in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, bear one another's burdens. Bear just simply means to take up in order to help carry, is that idea. And to help carry something that is a burden, that is burdensome. The idea of burden is burdensome. Weight in reference to its pressure or burden or load. We've all had that attitude, we've all had that feeling wherein we're worried about something, we're not sure we're going to get it accomplished, and then it gets taken care of, and someone says, oh man, it feels like a huge weight was just lifted off my shoulders. That's this idea of a burden. This text tells us that I'm supposed to help him bear his burdens. Let me make some observations about this. Because this is in a context of restoring the fallen, that we had this idea of burdens. Is this burden something which should have been born earlier and might have prevented him from being overtaken? Is that a possibility? Do you think sometimes that we get so self-absorbed that we don't recognize that people are struggling, that people are having difficulties, that people are having issues? We don't recognize that and we don't see that. And so as a result of that, because it's not seen, because we're too self-absorbed to notice, as a result of that, eventually sin overtakes them. They were struggling with this, and we were too oblivious to that, too self-absorbed. We didn't see that, we didn't notice that, and eventually they're overtaken. Maybe that's why Paul says, look, you need to help bear their burden, because had you been helping bear their burden previously, they might not be in the situation they're in now, had you not been so self-absorbed. Secondly, is this burden one which has been brought on by being overtaken? A consequence. And now I must help this one bear? There are some sins that individuals commit that as a result of that, they confess and they repent, but there are consequences that they're now bearing as a result of their sin. And consequences that they may continue to bear. Consequences that they may continue to, I guess I shouldn't say bear, but suffer. Consequences as a result of that. It is easy for me to say, well, if you hadn't sinned, you wouldn't be suffering those consequences, so this is on you. But what does the text say? What if this is a burden that this one that's been overtaken, that is restored, is now a consequence that they now have to suffer and endure and weather and try to get through and carry? It's not about me and about me trying to continue to inflict punishment. Is this something which in my mind should have been or should be now born due to such matters not being a burden to me? We reason that way, don't we? We hear ourselves say, well, I don't know why they're struggling with that. I don't have a problem with that. I don't understand why they've got an issue with that. But remember, brethren, I'm not the standard. The Lord didn't say that everybody's going to have the exact same burdens. We all don't have the same weaknesses. We all don't have the same struggles. We all don't have the same temptations. We all don't have the same desires. And so what is a burden for one may not be a burden for you. That's fantastic. Help that one bear that burden, because it's not a burden for you. It's one you can carry without there being any problem for you. That's why I think we are all different. Because what is one man's weakness is another man's strength, and they can bring the weak with them in their strength. But then Paul says, and this is kind of to me the more interesting part of this text, what might I think his sin says about me? Now I might think it says, I'm something because I didn't sin. But it doesn't. I might think it says, I don't need to examine myself. But it doesn't. I might think it gives me reason to boast. But it doesn't. Let's look at these three. I might think it says that I am something because I didn't sin. Look at verse 3. For if anyone thinks he is something. So I didn't just snatch that out of the air and throw that on the slide. That's straight out of the text. For if anyone thinks he is something. Now consider the fact that Paul recognizes there's a possibility that someone's going to think this. Paul's just not filling space. He's saying, look, in this process of restoring someone, I can see where someone might go to restore someone and think that, well, I must be righteous. I must be more pure. I must be more godly than they are because I didn't do what they did. That must mean I'm godly. I'm righteous, more godly. And Paul says, I recognize that someone might look at this situation that they're involved and think that. And if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. That's what Paul says. How does that work? Well, I didn't sin. I don't need to be restored. I don't need help with my burden. Therefore, I'm something. You see, I'm not in the position where this person is. And so since I'm not there, that in my mind, I had this thought process, that must mean that I'm something, that I'm better. Paul says, in reality, you're nothing. Let me tell you what I think Paul means by that. The Greek is subjective, according to Alfred, and being if, and this is his translation of it, being if he would come to himself and look on the real fact, nothing. The real fact of what? Where is he gauging his worth? If I gauge my worth on others' failures, that really says nothing about my value, does it? I've not said a thing about me. I've not shown that I've got any value. But there are some individuals who will look at others and say, well, I didn't do that, so therefore I must be something because look where he's at. And Paul says, if that's how you're gauging your value, if that's how you're gauging whether or not you're something or not, then you're looking at the wrong standard. That is not where you gauge your value on the basis of someone else's failures. I might think it says I don't need to examine myself, but it doesn't. Here's how this works. Well, I'm not the one who sinned. I don't need to examine myself or to look at myself. Why don't you consider something? Another sins, verse 1. But where should others be looking, and who should they be examining? Themselves. They're not looking at the one who has sinned. They're not examining the one who has sinned. That's already been determined. That person's in sin. And so there's no need to look there. There's no need to examine there. Where we need to be looking and we need to be examining is I need to be looking and examining myself lest I also be tempted. Another has sinned, but my looking and my examining is on myself. And then think about this. Who is exhorted to look at and examine themselves? Who are the people in this text who are told to go and restore that one? Not the naive, not the new Christian, the spiritual. The spiritual. What is that? Well, those individuals that are strong, the spiritually strong, the spiritually minded, the one who recognizes and sees the problem here. And they know that something needs to be done. The spiritual. And yet, what does he tell the spiritual? You need to examine yourself. You may be in the same boat. If the spiritual must examine, they are not immune to a misstep. What does that say about the less spiritual? You know, say, well, I'm spiritually minded. There you go. You better be examining yourself. And so if the spiritually minded, if we want to, like we're so bad about doing it, we want to put everything on a scale, if those on the highest of the scale had to be examining themselves in this situation, what does that say about everyone else who falls somewhere down below? The point is there anyone in a situation like this who should not be examining themselves? No one. If the spiritual need to be doing it, boy, that answers the question for everybody else, doesn't it? We all need to be examining ourselves. What does that do? That tells me that I can nowhere at any time think I'm above and beyond that temptation. Because what does Paul say? Examine yourself so that what? You too will not be tempted. There's always the possibility of the roles being reversed. There's always that possibility. And where I think that those roles will never be reversed and that I would never do that, I hearken you back to the scripture we read this morning or quoted, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. I might think it gives me a reason to boast, but it doesn't. What is boasting? Well, the basis for, or the content of one's feeling of legitimate pride, the basis of pride, the reason for being proud, this is the basis, this is the reason. I'm proud of this. My pride, my proudness is based upon that. Based upon what? But each one must examine his own work, that he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not in regard to another. Who is the another in this text? The one who has been overtaken in a trespass. Don't look at the other one over here and say, well, I'm going to boast because I'm not in that position, and so the basis of my boasting is not being where he is. Zodiates said it also refers to the object of boasting, the ground of glorying and exultation. Let me give you some observations. The basis of my pride is in the fact that they sinned and I didn't. My pride is not based upon my own work, but upon his failure. This type of boasting sometimes can be subtle. And we may do it and not even realize that that's really what we're doing. We may say something like, well, I don't understand how they could do that. And I recognize that that can be spoken in a genuine way. I don't know how a Christian could do that. I don't know how a child of God could commit that. I don't know how a servant of the Lord could act in that way. And that may be genuine. But brethren, we better really examine ourselves, because that could be a subtle boast. In that it could be, I don't understand because I don't see myself ever doing that. Is that really the attitude in back of, I don't understand how they could do that? Or, I don't understand because that's a line I would never cross. You see, that's a subtle boast, isn't it? That's me looking at their failure and saying, well, I would never do that. I don't know how they did that. That's boasting in someone else's failures. And yet the spiritual are warned to look to themselves lest they also be tempted. We think about boasting and we think that, well, that would be someone who is just a new Christian. Who would ever do that? Who would ever boast about such a thing? And yet, who is involved in this text? It is the spiritual who are told, be careful that you don't boast when you go to restore that one. And when you go to restore that one, think that, yes, you're a spiritually minded person, and because you're spiritually minded, you would never do that. I can't believe you did that. I would never cross that line. Be careful. What does the text say? Lest you also be tempted. Here's the point of all that, brethren, is that not a one of us is above the person that we are attempting to restore. Not a one of us is above that person. And just how quickly the roles can be reversed in our lives. And so while I may be in a position where I go and attempt to restore someone, number one, that is my goal, restoration. That's my number one goal. And if I can keep that in my mind, I may be furious, I may be angry, I may be so irritated, but my goal, they need to be restored because their soul is in danger. If I can get that in my heart and make that a genuine goal, now I'm going to be able to be gentle. Because it won't be about me now. And even if they attack me, it won't be about me. And I can weather that attack. And it will roll off me. Go ahead. Because it's not about me. My goal here is not defending my integrity, not defending my reputation. My goal is to restore you. So give me your best shot. I'm still going to be here attempting to restore you in gentleness and meekness. And I'm going to help you bear that burden. If you return to the Lord and you're having to struggle with the consequences of that, I'm not going to continue to remind you that, well, you know, if you hadn't done that, well, you know, if you hadn't sinned, well, you know, if you hadn't been overcome and trespassed. That's not helping someone to bear a burden. Because again, what is my goal? Is restoration. And once they're restored, I want to keep them restored. And so if keeping them restored is helping them bear that burden to keep them from falling back into that which I brought them out of, wouldn't you gladly want to do that? Why would you not do that? But I've got to be careful that as I look at this situation, I recognize that this is saying nothing about my spirituality. This is saying nothing about my righteousness. So I might think it says I'm something because I didn't sin, but it doesn't. And I might think it says I don't need to examine myself, but it doesn't. And I might think it gives me reason to boast, but it doesn't. What is your attitude toward those who are overtaken? This is a challenging text because in many ways the attitude that we have and the disposition that we go to those with that we are attempting to restore, and even the attitude that we maintain after they are restored. It's critical that we have the right godly attitude so that we restore them and then we keep them restored, because it's not about me. It's about their restoration and their staying saved. If there's something that we can do to help you make your life right this evening, would you let us know? If you need to be baptized, if you need the prayers of the congregation, let us know what we can do. Come forward while together we stand and while we sing.